Good evening. Welcome to Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. And I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua. And today's guest is Reverend Terrence Thomas. Reverend Thomas is a pastor. Reverend Thomas is a pastor in the AME faith tradition. He ministers at Bethel AME Church in Champaign, Illinois. He is a community activist and a Black liberation theologist. And we are here today to discuss Black liberation theology, the current condition of African American people in the struggle for freedom and justice around the world. Welcome, Reverend Thomas.
Thank you for having me, Doc. Thank you for having me. I'm a little nervous, man. Normally I do these shows. These are with peers. I got one of the mentors and the elders. Let me sit up straight. Should have had a cup of coffee right here.
Well, I appreciate that, brother. I sincerely appreciate that. So what I try to do here is give my audience an initial sense of who you are, right? Who the guests are. And what I ask folks to do is begin by giving us some background in terms of where you're from, right? Where you spent your formative years, right? I'm interested in that period from, say, really 11 to 18, where consciousness is developing, where you're somewhat able to get out of the house on your own. And so what I want to know is where did you spend those formative years, right? And how did your class background, the place that you grew up, and the historical moment, right, the time, how did that impact your developing political consciousness? And in your particular case, your decision to become a minister and to gravitate toward Black liberation theology?
Okay. I'm a proud South Side of Chicago native, born 1975, August 10th, 1975, to the late Lamar Thomas, the late Maria Thomas. Six children, six of us. I'm number four. Both parents had children, got together and had me and my brother. So it's kind of that weird dynamic where I'm the oldest of a set, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm one of the younger children. It's funny that you lifted up that age, 11 to 18, because at that time it was an interesting time in Chicago. We were on the heels of the first Black mayor, Harold Washington. My dad was one of his bodyguards. He worked with the campaign. He worked with Ed Gosser, Renault Robinson, Pat Hill, all of those folks who really helped elect Harold Washington. I was in proximity to Jesse Jackson.
Let me slow your roll. See, well, probably everyone is familiar with Jesse Jackson.
Okay.
But you mentioned some giants, but I'm not sure that they had the same stature outside of Chicago and the state of Illinois. So Renault Robinson, he's connected with a particular organization. So can you speak to Renault Robinson and perhaps link your father into this activist group?
Sure. So if you give me a moment to walk through the history. At the heels of the Democratic Convention of '68 and Old Man Daley's, Richard M. Daley's proclamation to shoot to kill any looter and shoot to maim any arsonist, Black police, and on the heels of Fred Hampton's assassination, Black police in the city began to kind of experience this uptick in activism, right? They realized that this is our profession, but something's wrong with this department. So Renault Robinson he was an officer, he began to challenge the systemic racism present in the Chicago Police Department. In his punishment, they gave him some of the worst details. He had to guard an alley. He had to walk a beat, 20-mile beat. He was constantly suspended. From this, he created something called, at the time, the Afro-American Policemen's League, right?
Patrolman Association.
Right. It started off as the association. And from there, he began to gather this cadre of police officers who it's not like policing now. They had some kind of consciousness, right? They were
Hmm.
not trying to, it's nothing like it is now. That's a whole nother story why I struggle with modern cops. I grew up with a different kind of cop. And so they came together uh, and started working on this organization. Or now this is 68, 69 that the league launches. A little bit after that, Old Man Daly dies. There's this push to try to get a black mayor. They really can't get the black mayor to jump off. They get Mike Belandick. And in the midst of this, of Mike Belandick, for those who don't know, he was a mayor after Richard Daley. He was notorious during the blizzard, I believe, of 77 with instructing city services to ignore the black community. So you had black people stranded on L platforms, couldn't get plowed out of their houses. He literally redirected city services from black communities on the south and west side of Chicago to take care of white communities. This led to a disruption in the machine. The machine had an infight that led to the election of Jane Byrne, first woman mayor. She ran as a liberal. She ran as a progressive. She wanted to make all of Chicago kind of inclusive. From there, Jane Byrne, once she gets elected, though, she reneges on all of her promises. If you are a student of history, you know that she changed the CHA board from predominantly black to all white women. She did this stunt when she moved into Cabrini Green. She just was very problematic. And that's a whole nother class. One day I'll teach it, but there's a whole nother class about the history. But the key thing out of all this was that the black political activity in Chicago began to stir and inspired by groups like Operation Push, the African American Patrolmen's League, etc. And they had a plebiscite that led to them selecting a candidate, Harold Washington. Now, history would show out and play that Richard Daley's son would enter into the race after a contentious election. Harold Washington was elected first black mayor of Chicago. And, you know, those officers that supported, those officers that worked with him, many of them found themselves on his mayoral detail. So my dad was one of them. He's a bodyguard for the first black mayor. He worked in the office of the first black superintendent, Fred Rice. So this was the kind of construct and activism I grew up around. And so even when they would have the meetings and things like that, Dad would take me. He believed, one, I was always interested in history. I can't explain why, even as a little boy, it was always something about it. He would take me, he would talk to me, he would explain to me the issues. I remember back in 86, 87, when they had the first Vietnam parade, he took me and introduced me to some of the black units and talked about the complexities of Vietnam. So my father was instrumental in my political education. Now, that probably leads to the question, well, what about your mother? As the universe and craziness would have it, my mother was a devout Jehovah's Witness. So she struggled with all of this my father was teaching me because JW, Jehovah's Witness theology, is very conservative, very evangelical. And so sometimes I don't even know how they managed to make it work, but they made it to work. But interesting enough, out of that grows my spirituality and my desire to be a minister. So even as a little boy, I would want to be the kind of brother that went door to door. We all know what Jehovah's Witnesses do. They go door to door. They ask you, do you want to be one? I always envisioned myself in doing it. But then I would tell my mother, I'm going to go into the barber shops. I'm going to go into the beauty shops. I'm going to do it in the mall. And she would get frustrated and say, that's not what we do. We go door to door. But I think my parents, they created an interesting parallel that somehow converged into where I am today. Of course, me being 46, I came of age with a different type of hip hop. My favorite rap group of all time is Public Enemy. If Public Enemy is in a concert, I'm there. I can't grow up listening to X Clan, Kool Moe Dee, KRS One. So even that informed my socialization. And as a little boy, I remember when school started, the teacher would make us stand up and say, hey, black child, do you know who you are, who you really are? Great Negroes past and present was adorned in the classroom, the old Ebony Brown volumes where they would talk about, throughout the year. All of this was always around me. And definitely at the start of every day, we would sing either Young, Gifted, and Black or Lift Every Voice and Sing. So it's in this context that, and ironically, it was out of Chicago public schools. And people nowadays like, you really got that in Chicago public schools? Yes, I did. Mrs. Kendricks, Miss Mitchell, Mr. Barnes, all of them taught us, hey, if you're going to be the best street sweeper you can, young brother, hold your head up high. So it was this kind of construct that I came of age uh, in Chicago. Um, a lot of other things were happening at that time. Ben Wilson was murdered, and that put the city on an interesting kind of notice. They were trying to figure out what to do with the housing projects. I remember there was a time when you drove up the Dan Ryan from maybe 55th to 22nd was miles and miles of housing projects, or on the west side across from where the great Chicago Bulls played was housing projects, or in Bronzeville, housing projects. And so it was all of this kind of shifting that was happening that kind of formed me into who I was, um, interacting with these various pieces.
Thank you, Reverend. And again, I think that our audience appreciates getting a sense of coming to understand how a person developed their political consciousness. Now, you're also a product of a particular type of Black studies education. And I'm thinking Governor State, Armstead Allen, that there's a whole group of, again, people who are giants in Chicago and the state of Illinois, but they may not have the same resonance nationally. But can you talk about and discuss the theories, methodologies, and the practices of the type of Black studies that you were grounded into, and name some of your mentors, and explain that scholar activist tradition in which scholars were connected to the community and were engaged in struggle. They didn't just write about struggle, they were participants in struggle. And so that's the kind of Black studies I know that you were mentored into. So can you tell us about that?
Sure. So when I left, I didn't graduate on time, and that's a whole nother conversation. So I went to an alternative high school, Olive Harvey Middle College. And it was there that I initially was introduced to the kind of Black studies that would would change my life. However, I went away to Fisk University in Nashville. Um, Made it all the way to my junior year. Two things happened. Had my first son, got in trouble for a student protest. Uh, was asked to leave. So when I came back, the then principal of the middle college, the late Helen Hawkins, said, "You got to finish school, bro. You just too bright. God is working too much through you." And she said, "Go enroll in Olive Harvey, and I want you to go downstairs and either find Armstead Allen, Harold Rogers, or Dan Parker." And those were the three scholars of that department at the time. Luck would have it, I was introduced to Dan Parker first. He was a counselor, he was an advisor. He helped me get through the grief of being expelled from Fisk. He helped me get through the grief of being, not necessarily grief, but the struggles of being a first time father. And I took his class, Introduction to African American Studies, um, and fell in love with it. I always liked history, even if Fisk, my major was history and secondary education, but fell in love with African American studies. And so, ironically, Mr. Parker was getting ready he was on step down to get ready to retire. He sent me to another professor, Armstead Allen.
Before you go there to Brother Armstead, what was it that made you fall in love with Black studies?
It was our story, right? And the book we use, I still own to this day, The People's Primer of African American Studies. It's a red book about this big, thin paperback. It's by Abdullah Kalamat. Still on my library. It will stay on my library to the day I die. And what made me fall in love with it was I found it vastly different than some of the history we did at Fisk, some of the political science we did at Fisk. At Fisk, it was an acknowledgement of the Blackness, but we spent a lot of time with European histories, European theologians, not theologians, I'm sorry, political scientists. And I never found us in the story, right? It always felt distant. I'm not sure how a European farmer can explain the life of a guy from the inner city. But when I started taking Black studies, it was something about this story being about us. So we didn't have to, when we talked about the civil rights movement, we didn't have to make the obligatory statement, we wouldn't have made it without white people. When we talked about Black politics, it was okay to talk about our successes and our victories without always kind of having to pull in white folks to make other people comfortable. Mr. Parker stood up there and taught us about in that introductory class. It was 6 o'clock Monday, Wednesdays. Taught us about our history, our struggle, you know, our overcoming as people of African descent. He taught us about who we were, and I think that's what made me fall in love with it. The narration that this was our story. Like we didn't have to constantly, you know, keep big up in everybody else to tell our triumphs. And that was a stark difference from, say, the African American history class I took at Fisk. Um, it was stark difference. I remember fighting with my professor, Miss Linda Wynn, and I still love Dr. Wynn. We communicate from time to time, but I swear to God, and I tell her this day this, we couldn't talk about one black success without acknowledging some white person in the room. So when we talk about the civil rights movement, you know, black people came together and we were out there in Birmingham. Yeah, but it was a white guy and white judge. Like, can we just tell our story? Because I didn't see the purpose in constantly bringing in somebody European to tell our story. I remember we were talking about Sister Mary McLeod Bethune, AME sister, scholar, elder personified. And one of my colleagues was waxing on about her greatness, and she said, well, if it wasn't for Eleanor Roosevelt, Mary McLeod Bethune wouldn't have. And I was like, did we have to even like do that? And so it was in that sense that Black studies made me fall in love. But it just dawned on me, and I think I like the way you're doing these questions. Even before this, I had a high school history teacher who I always lift up, Miss Teresa Perry. And also the book she had us reading in that class still sits on my shelf, Before the Mayflower. And I think even before I got to Fisk, it was Miss Perry's class that triggered that love. Because I still got that, it's older edition, like you can't even use the edition no more. But I still look at the notes and the curiosity I had as a young 16-year-old in that class. And so I want to say even the start of it, before Olive Harvey, before Fisk, was in Miss Perry's African American history at High Park.
Now you were getting ready to talk about Armstead, Dr. Armstead Allen. So he's one of those giants that we spoke of.
I walk in the Armstead office at the damn park, and I introduce myself. And back then, I thought I was a Black Panther. Back then, I was in love with the Panthers. I was in love with the Nation. I love both of those groups. Sometimes I figure out, how did you make it work? And you can't look at the wall. You can tell to this day I still have that love. And I remember I was telling him, who I was, and he sat back and he said in his own voice, well, who have you studied under? And so I told him a little bit what I did at Fisk. He said, oh, okay, well, I mean, there's some work you have to do. And so he had me take his class, Analysis of White Racism. It was Analysis of White Racism. And the book we used was Racism in the Post-Civil Rights Era by Clovis Sims, also Jabulani Makalani. And in that class, we talked about analysis of white racism. And what I loved about Professor Allen and how though I met Mr. Parker first, Armstead wound up being my intellectual father, was his methodology. Armstead wasn't an emotional guy. Beloved elder wasn't emotional. He wasn't led with emotion. He was about analysis, data. Where can you prove this, right? And so he was about looking at trends. We did a class, Psychology of White Racism. He talked about that. There were others, and what I loved about Mr. Allen was, when you asked about his methodologies, I'm trying to name a good way of putting it, because he didn't pick one school over the other. I think he leaned more towards what I would call the Harold Cruz model. He definitely a disciple of Harold Cruz. But he also had no problem with using Dr. Karenga. He also had no problem with using Du Bois. He also had no problem in bringing in Dr. Jabulani Makalani. And so he, I believe, had a broad stroke approach to Black studies. And what he used to always say to us was, I give you all of this so you all can pick your lane. I'm not trying to create robots, but I'm trying to create scholars who will go out here and take the Black studies mission to the community in the best way you know how. So some of my peers became cultural nationalists. Some of us became socialists and started operating in that space. Some of us found it through other means, the arts. but he gave it to us in a different way. Uh, Other people in that department, Ismay Ashford, she was a black literature. So we were introduced to Richard Wright, uh, Toni Morrison. We were introduced to Tony K. Bambara. We were introduced to Langston Hughes, and all of that, and how those stories thread through a theme. Right, I will never forget the class she taught on Roots, and encouraged us to read the book Roots as opposed to watching the old TV show, because she said the TV show was tailored for a time. So that's why you have a lot of themes in there about reconciliation and all of that in the TV show that doesn't show up in the book. She had us read The Spook That Sat by the Door. Uh, I read everything from Richard Wright in that Black literature class. And of course, the late, great Harold Rogers. Now, if there's somebody that introduced us to Black socialism, to liberation movements in Africa, it was him. And so in his class, the history of Africa from the ancient times to colonial and post. So we got introduced to the liberation movements of Africa. We got introduced to start learning about Patrice Lumumba. We Amir Cabral. We started. I mean, it's if I would spend all day calling a roll. We learned that listen, we were taught the wrong things about Fidel Castro. It was the Cuban government that stopped the South African government, the Cuban military that stopped the Angola, South African government from conquering Angola. And so that's why Nelson Mandela reached out to him. We learned about Nelson. We learned about Winnie. We learned that he was part of that. And so I think, and then lastly, the last addition to the department was Zeta Johnson, Dr. Zeta Johnson, who I actually went to high school with. She was about culture, and her thing always was about teaching you authentic African, authentic Black culture, because Zeta would say, if you don't know your culture, someone will sell you a culture and you will buy it. And so she was always critical about is that authentic Blackness, or is that a manufactured Blackness that you're buying? And so we would talk about it by that time, hip hop, the movies coming out, the 90s hood movies and things like that. And so I think that all of this came together to form a perfect pool of what I believe a true Black studies education is. You're exposed to different things. Now, it's up to the person, the student, to pick a lane, but you're exposed to all of it. Where it all came together, Doc, is this thing called the annual Black Studies Conference. And it's no longer gone, and it's my life ambition to bring it back. But the annual Black Studies Conference ran for about 40 years, I think, 35, 40 years.
Yeah, close to 40 years for sure.
It was the oldest conference in anywhere, junior college, grad school in the nation. It was, you wouldn't have thought that this small junior college would produce this conference, but every year in the spring, sandwiched in between the National Council on Black Political Science and the National Council on Black Studies, Olive Harvey College will hold this conference, and there scholars from around the world will come in. So I got introduced to the late great Njeri Jackson, feminist personified, political scientist personified, Dr. Malana Karenga, Dr. Floyd Hayes, Dr. Carl Spite. All of these names I would encourage our viewers to Google, to check out. The late great Dr. Charlie Martin. Dr. Spite and Dr. Martin worked with Armstead. Those were like my intellectual uncles. We got introduced to Mac Jones, the legendary Dr. Mac Jones, political scientist personified. Like, there's not a Black political scientist out of the South that hasn't studied under Mac Jones at some point. Dr. Ricky Hill, Dr. Marvin Hare, even some of my contemporaries, my best friend, Dr. Joseph Jones, who's president of Arkansas Baptist, now professor at Clark Atlanta. My homegirl, Dr. Kathy, my man, Andre Russell, who's doing community work. And what made this conference beautiful is, like, there are oftentimes, and you know this, you go to these academic conferences, you can't get close to these folks. I literally had lunch with Dr. Charles Jones at the time out of Georgia State, Dr. Beverly Stewart, Dr. Darlene Clark Hines. We would sit at the same table, and they would pour into us and say, "No, young brother, this is what you think. I want you to think about that." My homegirl at DePaul, Dr. Valerie, before she became the chair of the department, she was a professor, and she would help us write our papers. And we would be sitting there during lunch or in the conference students would present. Now, what I love about Olive Harvey, that it was merciless. We call that the snake pit. And what it taught me as a student was you got to bring your A game. Just because you're a student, ain't nobody gonna give you. So when we have our student panels and we present and say something crazy, listen, we got corrected, but we were better for it. And so I think that that trained me in a particular type of Black studies that I don't know. Sometimes I feel like an antiquated because what I was
Mm.
trained in isn't what Black studies is anymore, and I don't know if that's for good or ill yet. I have a thought, and ask me privately, I'll tell you. But we were taught, you know, and ultimately, and then I'm gonna end on this point. It wasn't just to go sit in the classroom and write 1,000-page blogs. We were expected to take all of this that we learned and go do something with it. And so we were expected to listen, even if you don't become a Black studies professor, even if you don't become a Black studies scholar, wherever you walk into a room, your fundamental question is, what is the role of a Black studies scholar in this space? So when I got to
Mm-mm.
seminary, the fundamental question, and it drove my peers crazy, for me was, what is the role of the Black studies scholar in seminary, right? What is the role of the Black studies scholar when I work in this nonprofit? What is the role of the Black studies scholar as a public school teacher? And we were supposed to take the Black studies mission out into
Mm-mm.
the world.
So you take that mission into seminary school, and what I want to do is kind of turn a bit and talk about. Well, you know, you're an ordained minister. You're in the African American. Excuse me. You're in the African
Methodist.
Methodist Episcopal tradition. And I want you to talk about the relationship between the AME Church and Black Liberation Theology. And if you could, can you highlight the core principles of Black Liberation Theology?
Sure. Um, so the simplest way to put it is the AME Church is the oldest African American denomination in everywhere in the world. It comes out of the Methodist Church, and so that's why it's African Methodist Episcopal. Episcopal being the structure, Methodist being the theology. Charles Wesley Methodist, and African because we were black.
Okay,
Um,
now when you say Episcopal is the structure, I think you got a mainly lay audience. What
okay,
does that mean in real?
in simple terms, we are led by a bishop, and the bishop is sits at the top of the denomination, and then there are presiding elders and sort of service middle management, and then the bishop appoints pastors of churches. So it's not like some denomination. I didn't apply to the Bethel job in the truest sense. My bishop looked at the needs of the church, the needs of the community, and then said, who do I have in the pool of pastors and ordained clergy that can serve? And so when I say Episcopal, whenever you hear Episcopal, there's always a bishop or a council of bishops that are over the structure. And so AME Church uh, in the late 1700s, I don't want to give exact dates because I got other things, but they were at St. George's in Philadelphia. These black people, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and a few others, they're trying to pray, Doc, at the altar. The white congregants have been slightly annoyed with the growing African presence in their congregation. And so, in the middle of altar call, and for those who are not church, that's the time where you go to the altar. It's a really sacred time in the Christian tradition where you're praying and you're laying out your laments. And they literally drug these black people up and off their knees. And of course, black folks then, hey man, can we just finish our prayers and then we'll leave? And they, nope, get up. And so they got up and they walked out and they formed their own denomination. Uh, and it also grows out of the Free African Society, which was a sort of a what we would call a nonprofit today. It's a nonprofit then that wanted to help enslaved and free Africans make it in this country. And so the AME Church is formed, and the AME Church is in our discipline, it's in our DNA. One of the things it talked about was the social needs of the people that we're called to serve. And so even before we get to a thing called Black liberation theology, it's present in one of our leaders, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who proclaimed loudly and boldly that God was a Negro. It's in the working of what many readers might know, David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world. If you've been anywhere in a Black history or Black studies class, you probably heard of this document. It's David Walker's. You know Martin Luther's 90-second thesis. What they had that fight among the white preachers. This is the functional equivalent of that, and probably a greater document in which David Walker lays out a liberation theology and why slavery and slaveholders are problematic and go against God. Denmark Vesey was associated with the AME Church, the great African who led a slave revolt. And though I don't want to get into that because it's a separate conversation, Harriet Tubman was part of the AME family. She was African Methodist AME Zion. And so even there, let's continue on through history. Mary McLeod Bethune, Rosa Parks, A. Philip Randolph, Daisy Bates. So this construct of a church doing the work that God told them to do to help other people be free is there. And it culminates with a young, powerful preacher from Little Rock, Arkansas, named James Hal Cone, who in the late 60s, at the height of Black Power, starts to ask fundamental questions during his spiritual journey, during his time as a teacher at Philander Smith College. Is God on our side? And he comes to the conclusion, yes. Not only is God on our side, not only was Bishop McNeil right, God is on the side of the oppressed. God empowers us to fight oppression. God is a God of justice. The moral arc of the universe bends in this way, and so puts forth something called liberation theology. Now, you'll probably hear people talk about this Latin American guy, Gustavo Gutierrez, who kind of takes up Cone's work and applies it to Latin American construct. So that's why it's the distinction, Black liberation theology, because Cone's work is centered in our context. Gutierrez works is Latin America, but Cone beats him by a couple of years. But both are critical because the premise of it is not only is God on our side, we have a responsibility to fight off the shackles of oppression. So, and I'm gonna stay with Latin America just to illustrate this. A lot of your liberation movements that came out of the 60s out of Latin American countries were led by liberation theologians to a point, and that's a whole nother conversation, that they had to start sending the 700 Club and Pat Robertson and them into them countries to dilute it. They sent Prosperity Gospel, because that was the test group, into them Latin American countries to dilute it, and then later you see what happened to the Black community. And so Cone is writing this now. Cone isn't the only one. You have Dwight Hopkins out of North.
Hopkins he's a student of Cone's.
I believe he is.
Okay.
We got the legendary Jeremiah Wright.
Yes.
We got Reverend Dr. Otis Moss. And out of liberation theology comes womanist theology. So that's a part of Black liberation theology, womanist theology. So just to name a few, we got Reverend Dr. Renita Weems, Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, late Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney.
Now let me challenge something here. Cone, God of the oppressed, all the things that you spoke about, but there's a brother called J.D. Otis Roberts, whose major work was, Is God a White Racist? Can you round that square?
So that book is any preacher that tell you that book doesn't throw you, it does. Because the premise of that book is, out of all the things Black people been through, where's God? And so, is God a white racist? Is God beating up on us? Does God have it out for Black people? And that's the premise of it. A comparative example of that would be Elie Wiesel's Night, right? Where were you in all of this? Yahweh, where were you? I don't think you real. So that's kind of where that book is going. The challenge then, though, Cone would say, and Robinson's work is picked up by a former AME clergy, Anthony Penn, who's now an atheist, but he writes great work on Black Theodicy, which is Black suffering in the presence of God. Where is God during all this Black suffering? Robinson would raise the question, where is God in our suffering? Cone would say, where were you? Or were you sitting around waiting on God? And I think both questions are valid. And I'm not certain at this level, certainly, I'm not even certain I can answer either one. I know that both questions are valid. God, where are you? And God is saying back to, where were you? And so when we see evil in the world, and this is the challenge of the Black church today, when we see evil in the world, do we stand up with our heads up, looking at the sky, waiting for Jesus to come down like an avenger? Or do we use the power? And I know everybody's not a believer, so I'm speaking in Christian language, so I'm not proselytizing. But do we use the God-given power that's put into us to go transform the world? Because the Bible says, Jesus tells his followers, greater things that are in you. I have to go, but I'm putting something in you to continue this work. You'll be able to move mountains. You'll be able to take down systems. You'll be able to break things down if you just believe and do and act. And so I think there's this dance, because then Robinson will say, well, we were there and we did all that, nothing happened. And then Cone will say, well, did we really do all we could do? So I think there's this dialogue that has to happen. But for the believer, both questions are valid. And now most church folk is going to shy from that book. Is God a white racist? I think that there's sometimes evidence for that, but I also think there's plenty of evidence for the reality that church folk ain't always did what they supposed to do. I mean, we have sat around, and I think that's because other traditions, again, if this was a spiritual conversation, other traditions have been influenced and been infused in us that's kind of diluted that. So we're back to a point of what Franklin would probably call the slave church. We're closer to the slave church than the Negro church and the Black church. We're still sitting around waiting for a great emancipator, as opposed to tapping in to the power that's in us.
So, as you trace the tradition of Black liberation theology, and you certainly describe the AME Church, and I would probably contend that the AMZ, CME, that in Black Baptist traditions, we're focused on liberating the enslaved Black population. And you bring that up to Cone and the present Dwight Hopkins. Where in that tradition do you place those late 19th century, early 20th century group of people known as the Black Socialist preachers? And here I'm talking about George Washington, the Reverend George Washington Woodbey. I'm talking about Bishop James Holly, Bishop Reverend Ransom from Chicago, right? Well, at least he pastored in Chicago. Gomez. That tradition, is it a building block for Black liberation theology, or is it something? Is it the stone that's cast away?
And I would add, even now, one of my favorite bishops, two of them, Right Reverend Francine Brookins, who just got elected, and Bishop Leith in that tradition. So those 19th century preachers, I think they got lost. I think they got lost in some conversations that has happened. One, and for our people that don't know, that was at the height of labor movements. That was at the height of scares around socialism. So I think that they got lost. I would definitely count them as Black liberation theologians. I would definitely count them as liberation theologians. I would even introduce to the conversation, I would count them on some levels as humanist theologians that say, listen, you got the power to do this. You stop waiting on God to fall out the sky. God already gave you everything that you wanted. And so I think that these preachers and thinkers heavily, if they would have gained traction, our church would have looked different. The problem is, though, they ran up against this thing that we often talk about, the American dream, right? This holding out for the American promise. And so if you're during that time, the late 1800s, 1870, 1890, early 1900, 1920, 30, and you're talking about a socialism as a spiritual construct, say over and against the fear mongering that came out of after the light of the Russian Revolution, your voice is going to get lost. I think, thanks to people like yourself, you've taught me about a couple of these guys. I think the thanks to other learned pastors like Jeremiah Wright, like the ones I lifted up. Angela Parker just wrote a great book about Black Lives Matter in the church. If I think that we have to pull those up because they were the stone that was cast away. I think that they were writing something that was missed in the context of the time. Much like I see them, much like we really don't appreciate the labor movement of A. Philip Randolph. We don't really appreciate like what that brother did for labor, because he, ultimately he union, socialist, all of that, in light of the scare. I think
Well,
that
he was also that strange configuration of a anti-communist socialist who did labor for the U.S. government and the
yeah,
CIA. Yeah.
but I mean he was a mixed bag. But I think that just like we don't acknowledge what he pulled off with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Reporters, people like, oh yeah, he had this union. Yeah, it wasn't a little bit more than a union, right? Um, and I think these preachers are lost. Uh, it also let me take a moment to say this to our viewers: Black Christians aren't as backwards as often portrayed in media and by some of the things they say. Everything I'm talking about now, you learn in seminary. It's not a seminary that you not. I'm talking real seminary. I ain't talking about Liberty. I'm talking about Garrett, Princeton, Payne, ITC in Atlanta. I'm talking about Fuller. And for most major denominations, that's UCC, United Church of Christ, any variation of the Methodist, some Baptists. Um, you got, in order to be ordained, you got to be seminary trained. The challenge is, though, do we bring this stuff out of the classroom and teach it to the people?
Wait a minute. You're saying that in seminaries across the country, you're introduced to Cone, J.D. Otis Roberts, Wilmore, Gerard Wilmore, Black
Yes.
religion, Black radicalism. So why is there not as strong a base? In other words, if I walk into 100 Black churches, there's a white boy on the wall, right?
Yes.
And they might have an ATM in the in the vestibule. How do you account for that?
So I think now here's where it gets weird. I think that two ways to answer this. Um, Black men in seminary go for the checklist, not to be transformed, not to learn, not to be educated, not to. It's a checklist. I want to be a preacher. I'm gonna write whatever y'all tell me to do. This is been my experience. And some people may have a different experience, but I stand on my experience. So out of 10 cats, maybe 7 just going for the checklist. 3 of us want to be transformed. With sisters, I think it's the inverse. 8 of them want to be transformed. 2 of them just going for the checklist. But the church is heavily populated by men, and so I'll give you an example. This to Garrett for my PhD. I'm taking a PhD class at Garrett. The name of this class is Theologies of Black Life, and we are reading all of what we talked about tonight and some new stuff. There's another class, liturgy. That's prayers, hymns, etc. of resistance and repair. And so one of the assignments for the students in this class, I was going to take it, but I didn't want to take the commute, is write a liturgy about reparations. Every seminary on some level has some kind of Black center. Garrett has the Center for Black Church Studies, CBE, Center for the CBE, Church Black Experience. Chicago Theological Seminary has the Center for Black Church Life. Like I might be conflating the title, so excuse me. But not Princeton has the Black Theological Leadership Institute. So every seminary on some level has this. The challenge is these brothers don't want to come out because they don't want to upset Mama Jenkins, who they would have to switch, right? It's sort of like I heard old Black studies scholars talk about how hard it was to teach them that, you know, George Washington owned slaves. Think of that classic Good Times episode where James in Florida was going to beat Michael for teaching them that George Washington owned slaves. And then finally, Michael had to walk his parents through. And so it's the same thing in preaching. If I take down that Jesus has been over my wall, I may not, that she not gonna tithe. And then if she don't tithe, I can't pay the light bill. If she don't tithe, I can't pay the mortgage. If she don't tithe, I can't pay the drummers. I can't pay the, you know. And so how do I balance that? And so a lot of them say, you know what, I know it, I'll try to teach it, but I'm not gonna rock the boat. Or I ain't believe it no way. I've had plenty of colleagues say, hey man, you took seminary too seriously. Hey man, you took it too seriously, bro. Just preach Jesus. And when I point out that Reverend Dr. Obi Hendricks would say Jesus was a radical, he was a leftist, he was on the side of the oppressed, he would say, that ain't what my Bible says. And so I think the challenge for those who watch who do believe is to demand, especially if your preacher is educated, hey man, give me that stuff you learned in seminary. Give me that stuff that you learned about Black liberation theology. Don't let them short you. And so, yeah, I would contend that I by far, I'm not the only preacher that knows about this. I think I'm one of the few that actually wants to live it out.
Then my question is this. Given that Black liberation theology has not built a core base within any Black religious denomination, what are you've discussed some of the obstacles to why, but what are the consequences that Black liberation theology is not the animating theology of Black religious denominations? What are the consequences for our people?
Well, we got a couple of more consequences. And here's where I say that all of this is still Black studies. Remember earlier in the conversation, I was talking about the influx of a certain type of theology to dilute Black liberation theology. And so now what you have is the rise of these non-denominational white churches that have come into the Black community, theological imperialists. You probably seen some of them. They I don't want to get your show in trouble, but they show up. They
brother. Well, man, I hate to cite someone that I consider to be a liberal traitor to our mission, but you know, there's the guy that talked about good trouble. Okay, I don't need to name him. You know, he's opposed to Black power, but I'm not denying.
As a fraternity brother of Mr. Lewis, I'm supposed to say something, but I'm gonna just keep going. So you see him Wood Creek, the Vineyard. You see him all these white mega churches that show up in campuses, and what they did was literally steal. Like Ice Cube say, jack the beats. They small group models, pastoral care. They provided an alternative to the Black church, who for whatever reason stopped caring. About certain issues, stop caring.
Well, stop caring or lost their financial base.
No,
the crack. So you don't think the crack epidemic and the economic devastation of Black communities that left people without the resources to contribute to the building of those institutions played a major role in creating the cracks that allowed these folks to come in?
The other part of it was, recently I taught Bible study for the AME Church, and I said that COVID-19 wasn't our first pandemic. It was the first pandemic we acknowledged. So we had an AIDS pandemic. We had a war on drugs pandemic. We had an uptick in community violence pandemic. We had a criminal justice pandemic. And the church, for whatever reason, let's take the easy one. This is low-hanging fruit, the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the drug pandemic. Many of our people left the church during this time because the church wasn't ministering to them. So it became like, oh, you got AIDS, you filthy human, you're going to hell, because etc. Well, nobody gonna sit through that. They're gonna leave the church. On top of the fact, what you said, I'm already broke. I'm struggling. I'm trying to support this church, and you ain't speaking into my life. So it's not an either or. It's a both and. I have plenty of friends that have found their way to them white non-denominational evangelical churches because they said that black church didn't speak to my. So when my mama was on drugs, nobody called me. They stayed away from me. When my brother was killed by gun violence, the pastor didn't come. When we tried to have little Jimmy funeral at the church, man, he told us we ain't tithe enough. He told us, and somebody who's watching this will say, well, that wasn't in my church. Great, here's your cookie. What I am saying though is it did happen, and it happened far too often. Several friends of mine who supported my seminary journey said, I want to see you become a reverend, a different kind of reverend, because I remember when my grandmama died and the church didn't let her have a funeral because grandmama was sick and she didn't come to church last year. So the pastor say she lost her way. And so that inspires me to be a different kind of reverend. And so these people wound up over there. And what these churches did was then weaponize them against the black church. So there's a Christian rapper, Lecrae. He's always saying something crazy about the black church. I'm not churchy. I don't get in all those traditions. Well, brother, what other tradition are you talking about? You black as the day is long. You didn't grow up in Stone Creek campus. So what tradition are you really talking about? You're talking about black church tradition, right? And so now I appreciate you making that distinction, because if you walk into Barnes and Nobles and ask for black theology, you're going to find not James Cone. You're going to find the B.D. Alloway. You're going to find Vody Baucham. You're going to find Tony Evans. You're going to find Anthony Bradley. And they all write evangelical stuff under the lens of black theology. I got tricked into buying a book called Reclaiming Black Theology.
Wait. See, you went down a expertise rabbit hole. So you understand what evangelical means in relationship to other approaches to religion, but I don't know that the audience gets that. So you got to do some unpacking for us.
Okay, fair enough. So when I talk about evangelical, I am talking about right-wing, very reactionary, conservative, think January 6th, think Trump type Christian, think the God bless America and nobody else, think I'm praying over bombs, think the duck season family, where all the hillbillies that prayed before they shot the animals. When I say evangelical Christian, that means that the Bible is inerrant. It has no errors. Everything in it is true, and we should be living it out. When I talk about evangelical Christian, let me give probably the easiest thing everybody knows, unless you've been living under a rock, The Handmaid's Tale, that TV show. That's the kind of society they want to set up, right? And they're clear on this. And so if you're on Facebook, just Google the Christian Post. This is your anti-vaxxers. This is your anti-intellectual. These are your folks that say, listen, we got to get rid of critical race theory. What is critical race theory? I don't know. It goes against my Bible. And so evangelicalism, now remember about 40 minutes ago, I talked about Pat Robertson and the rise of this moral. And you were a little bit older than me. I know when these guys came out with Reagan, y'all like, where did these preachers come from? I mean, there was always a Billy Graham, but they next episode.
Yeah.
They were literally propped up by the U.S. government.
But that next season.
Right. Next season. They were literally propped up by the U.S. government to go into Latin America and tell people your condition isn't because of social. Your condition is because you don't have enough faith. And so for people who've been fighting against systems of oppression, who've been fighting revolutions and counter-revolutions, it began to take hold. Like, okay, maybe liberation, God don't want us to be free like that. And so that's where you start hearing things like blessed and highly favored. That's when you start hearing the prosperity gospel. And so they worked it out in Latin America, and then they brought it home and perfected it on the black community. So you even where I'm at, you'll have people tell me, Rev, systems ain't got nothing to do with that, man. If you just give Jesus your life, if you just prayed, if you fast, if you stop looking at sundresses, if you read your Bible, the police won't shoot you. And then when I say, well, I know people that do all that and the police still shot them. How do you account for it? Well, God works in mysterious ways. You can't answer that. And so they have this cadre of black men and some women that they've propped up. The evangelical church has propped up the men that I named that have kind of co-opted the term black theology into really evangelicals with black face. And so, as I was saying, I got tricked into buying a book. I walked into Barnes and Nobles. I was like, I was starting seminary. I was excited. I said, "Oh, reclaiming black theology. This must mean we gonna bring James Cone and them back to the forefront." I was on the CTA bus and started reading how Cone didn't believe in Jesus and was wrong. I said, "Wait a minute, this ain't what I thought it was." And so then I went and asked one of my professors, and he said, "Oh, you got." There's another one that says reclaiming black. Another one, reclaiming black theology by Theo Adewale, and he talks about how Henry McNeil Turner didn't believe in God. He talks about how Howard Thurman was going to hell. He talks about how James Cone is going to hell. And so these are giants in black theology, right? Liberatory black theology. And they're basically saying, don't read them, y'all. And they have a podium, they have a platform, and all of them are attached to some white mega church, some with John Piper, etc. I think that's what's really challenging right now. We got to two things. People that know the truth have to speak out against that. One of my favorite pastimes is trolling Facebook and the Christian Post. That's why I can't post tonight, because I get on there and when they post Vody Bakum is a great black person, and I'll be like, who? When Lecrae talks that mess, I don't get into the politics. I'm a kingdom person. Yep, say that on the highway when the state trooper pull you over. And we have to be willing to challenge that. But the allure of them is their platform. They're all national. They damn near millionaires, Doc. They they get to go on the TV shows on the Fox News, and people write checks. Listen, one of the things to say about the right wing folks is they support their own. If I had a gripe against my people left or center, we don't write checks. But them guys get checks. Like Vody Bakum said he needed heart surgery and made $1 million an hour. Like, because people, we want you to live. So what we got to do to pay your health care? If I said I needed heart surgery, only person that's going to call you is you and one of my baby mom. Like, it's not going, Reverend Cass needs a heart. He needed a heart surgery. So, but that's an aside. Y'all support your left of center folks got to start putting money into it. Black Studies, our organizations, because the right has no problem putting money in nothing. There was a situation here where a cop was shot and killed, and before the end of the week, his widow had $500,000. Like
yeah.
Me and you get shot in Champaign. Our family they may bring Helen and my children some chicken. They may bring them some pop.
Right.
So
they may. Okay, so we got 15 minutes left.
Okay.
I got a question, and then I want to go to some comments in the chat that I want you to respond to. So my question is, at the core of anti-Black racial oppression is economic exploitation. I believe that is the central issue. Harold Barron called it the demand for Black labor. And as we know, Black folks have become superfluous, hence the prison, racialized incarceration. So how does Black liberation theology speak to the concrete material conditions of anti-Black racial oppression?
So whether we like it or not, the construct about the labor and how Black bodies is used is grounded in a white supremacist theology. That is founded in the story of Genesis and Ham. You're the servant of a servant, and your whole life will be to serve. Serve your brother. It's founded in the theology of the white man's burden. God wants us to go civilize the Negro, and we got to take care of these folks. Sort of like you talked about in your class earlier, prior to Bacon's Rebellion, this was a Christian slavery, and the enterprise as they proposed slavery was a Christian. The early debates: can we enslave Christian? Once we educate them in the Bible, are they human? And so Black theology says that you're more than chattel. In fact, you have the right and I'm gonna throw their words back at them, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You have the right to be free human beings. You have the right, a God-given right to self-determination. And not only does Black liberation theology does that, it tells you fight for what you want to know. So let's put that on a pragmatic level.
Mm-hmm.
As a preacher, I'm encouraging people, don't take these crappy salaries, make these restaurants suffer. And it may hurt me as a,
Right.
you may not be able to tithe, but as a preacher, don't work for less than minimum a living wage, not even a minimum wage. As a preacher, I'm going to be on the front line for redistribution of wealth. Why? Because in the book of Acts, the apostles took all of the goods and distributed evenly. And when they couldn't, they set up a system. That's where the deacon system comes from. Stephen was in charge of that, right? To take care of the widows and the orphans. And so Black liberation theology calls for a fundamental redistribution of wealth. Nobody should be praying to be a billionaire. You should be praying that your needs are met. You should be praying that your family needs are met. And you should be praying that if you got a little bit extra, you can put into the next person, right? And so as a preacher, as a Black liberation theologian pastor, I'm not telling my congregants to put 10% of their income into the tithing box. I'm telling them to do what God told them to do. So if God tells you to put $10 in there, that's I'm not in that. You did what God told you to do. If God told you to put 1,000 in there, I'm not in that. That's what God told you to do. I'm not assigning a number of that, because it's one of the comments said, what if you ain't got the resources? As a preacher, I'm not telling you to work 2 jobs to pay tithes. No, pay your rent, because the church can't cover you. You can't live here and you can't live with me. So pay your rent. This, this can wait. Black liberation theology talks about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, right? And so here I'm invoking the words of Dr. King and the writings of O.B. Hendricks, Reverend Dr. O.B. Hendricks, another AME scholar, that says that as a preacher, I need to be on the front line of all justice issues, especially as it pertains to Black bodies. So when the police shoot a young man, the church should be the meeting spot. The church should be, I should be the first person to stand up and say, hey, Black Lives Matter, BP 100, Ubuntu, Malcolm X Grassroots, y'all can meet at the church free of charge. Come on and hold your rally there. I'm not trying to proselytize, but it's safe. You're protected in my building, and come on and do it. When there are labor conversations, listen, I stay out of Walmart as best as much as I can, because ethically the practices aren't there. But all of this is because it's a faith question to me, Doc. It's a faith question to me. I believe, I'm a Christian unapologetically. I believe when I stand at the end of my life, when I close my eyes on this side and wake up on the other side, God is going to judge me by the things that in my Bible. Did you take care of the widows and the orphans? Were you kind to strangers? Did you do the things that I told you to do? The red letters. I ain't talking about the stuff the church has added. I told you, hey, listen, what you do to the least of these, you do this to me. 7 books of the Old Testament is all about God destroying nations over justice. You know this stuff. You paid $100,000 for education to learn this stuff, and you didn't do it. I'm done with you. I don't want that. And so for a Black liberation theologian, you show up in those spaces even when there's labor. You show up and be disruptive to systems that oppress Black bodies, wherever they are, be it the McDonald's paying people $7 an hour or the police shooting brothers and sisters in the street.
Okay, so I want to go to some questions, and I was initially thinking we would be able to end this at 8:15. We may have to go to 8:30 if that's okay with you, because there's people who participate in the show, and they make the show, right, to a certain degree. So James Thompson, who is a brother out of Chicago, I don't know if he's part of your generation or mine or younger, but he raised a question, one word, when you were talking about God and you were saying he, and he simply typed she.
I have no problem
with the chat.
So it was really, and you know me, Sundiata, I have, if I'm talking fast. So fair point. I don't believe God is a he. If you want to know my position, I'll unpack it, James. I believe God is actually more feminine than masculine. I think that masculine is one of the things they gave us when they gave us white Jesus. So I have no problem with a mother God. In fact, if you look at the Christian Trinity, the way I believe and the way a lot of my people believe, You can say Mother God, or the Holy Spirit can be feminine, because the Holy Spirit is a comforter, right? And oftentimes the comforters in our lives are the mothers and sisters. So I have no problem with that. I'm not one of the preachers that God is a man. Nah. If I was talking and for those who I offended, I apologize. I was moving too fast. Normally I catch myself on that. But yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'm just not one of them preachers. But you know that, Doc. I don't,
Yeah.
I don't do that. You won't hear me Father God in the death. It's
Well, that's why I wanted to give you a chance to correct the record.
yeah,
And I think that, as the more you spoke, it became clear, but the initial conversation did have some of those trappings. And so it was good that Brother James posed a question and you've unpacked it in a way that I would hope people would give some serious thought to.
right.
Now, there's another question here. Theodicy. Now, Theodicy is, how do you pronounce it?
Theodicy. And so basically,
Theodicy.
in
So the
simplest
question, let me
terms,
tell you the question. So the question is, that's the word you use. They've never heard of it. So go ahead and do what you was getting ready to do before I interrupted you and unpack it for us.
so theodicy simply is the question of God and suffering. And so it is found in the two books we lifted up. Is God a white racist? And I think the other, and probably equally as powerful, is Elie Wiesel's Night, Theodicy. Where is God in the midst of my
Mm-hmm.
suffering? This God, and because both of them raise the same point, this God that my grandmama paid to, this God that I got whoopings for not talking to, this God that I was told created me and made me perfect, and all of this at my lowest. When somebody murdered my mama in the alley, where was God?
Mm.
When somebody put me in a box car and transported me to a concentration camp, where was God? When Emmett Till was being drowned in the Tallahatchie River, where was God? And so Theodicy talks about the suffering and tries to give an explanation, or makes us wrestle with suffering, right? Makes us wrestle with suffering. And so that's the term. So one of my favorite Theodicy theologians that operates in it is a brother by the name of Anthony Penn. Um, Anthony Penn was a minister. He's now atheist. He doesn't attack the faith, but he talks about it. I got another partner, Kamasi Hill, Dr. Kamasi Hill, that talks about where is God in the midst of our suffering. And some of them come to the conclusion that God ain't in the midst of our suffering because God ain't real. Like this is what we create to help us process suffering. And so any preacher, now my other life, I was a hospital chaplain. And so I had to learn about theodicy, because sometimes ain't no cure. Ain't no cure for stage
Mm-hmm.
19 cancer. Ain't no cure as them machines is being turned off of life support. I've seen things that I would classify as a miracle, but other folks may not. And so how do we help a family member walk through that? What do you say that's not God wanted your mama to come home? Because that'll get you punched in the face. So how do we help you navigate the trauma? And that's theodicy.
Okay. Now, you're familiar with the concept of Ethiopianism that guided many Black religious folk during the era of slavery and in its immediate aftermath. And the Ethiopianists had a complex argument, right? It's built around is it Psalms 26? That one day Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hand unto God, and kings and queens will come into Egypt. And a number of pastors who use that, including uh, Henry McNeil Turner, argued that it was foreordained that God would allow white people to come and enslave Black folk, Africans, in order to teach them a lesson for abandoning the one true God. And they would in that enslavement, be Christianized and civilized. Is that a theodicy question?
It,
Or is
it
that just Negro foolishness?
is both in. So I don't know any preacher, serious preacher, that would argue. Let me take that back. I know several, but I'm gonna underscore serious theologian that would argue that American chattel slavery, colonialism was a divine punishment from God. While certainly people do argue that, which comes out of what you're talking about, I think that that would be the other side of the question that Cone would raise. Was that God or was that man being evil and not standing up and doing what's right? Uh, and then when we stand up, then God would give us the power we need. And for those who there's a story in the Bible that talks about pick up your mat and walk. There's a guy laying by a pool. He's waiting on somebody to do something for him. He's waiting on some kind of miracle. And Jesus says, "Hey man, listen, pick up your mat and walk. If you want it done, once you pick up your mat and walk, I got you." Or the feeding of the 5,000. When y'all collect, I'll do the miracle. And I think that that's kind of the pushback against that. That's at least my theology. God is waiting on us to collect the fish and loaves, right? God is waiting on us to come together, and then we'll step in. I think American theology, especially in Black churches, it's been guided by Disney princesses and superheroes. So we wait for, like, we wait for Batman Jesus to come out the sky, drop a smoke bomb, and get rid of all the bad guys. That's not how this thing works. We wait for some Prince Charming to come in and get rid of the Wicked Witch. A lot of this has been influxed in this fairy tale superhero motif. So I would contend most churchgoers, they worship the Avengers, not God. They're looking for Tony Stark and them to come through, because when you be like, "Hey man, are we gonna do this ourselves?" No, just wait a minute, it's gonna come. Did you sign the signal high enough? No, man, that's not how that works.
All right, now there's another question from Obioma Ohia, and I hope I pronounced the name correctly. And the question is this: is there a place for dialectical materialism in liberation theology? And I think you should read dialectical materialism as scientific socialism, Marxism.
I think it can be if you so, because the challenge in that, and I see that is the that faith and science are incompatible, but not necessarily. I think that's one of them questions, and I'm not trying to be metaphysical in my answer. If you want it to work, you can make it work. I'm not a preacher that believes in every single story of the Bible. I believe in some, most, but not every. So do I think that a man got swallowed by a whale and lasted in his belly with ass? No, I don't. But do I believe in the power of resurrection, life after death? I've seen that enough in my own personal life. I have died emotionally. I've attempted suicide. Like I've seen that. So I think that if you want to do that, we're living in a pandemic, right? In the middle of a pandemic. I'm not even y'all in the comments. I'm not going to argue this COVID thing with y'all. We are living in the middle of a pandemic, a plague of sorts, a plague that would. In the next Bible, as my colleagues say, when they write the next Bible, they're going to talk about the COVID plague. So I think that there is space for that. I think that if you look at, there's a great book that tries to scientifically explain some of the things that we read in the Bible. So what happened the day that the sun stood still? Well, that's a solar eclipse, but they didn't have the language for that back then. So I think that there's space for reason and faith, and I think that there's space for faith and reason. I don't. I struggle with that question. I appreciate the question. Definitely not running it, but I think it's if you want it to be right. I know preachers that eschew all kind of intellectualism. I'm strictly by faith. But I got a homegirl, man. She don't believe demons. She don't believe in a lot of stuff. She's about science and reason, but love her some Jesus. So I think that if you want to attempt to marry him, you can. Now, I think I'm rare in that. I think that most people try to draw heavy distinctions, but I think it's space for definitely for that in there.
Would you say that certainly in his earlier career, Cornel West attempted to do a synthesis of Black liberation theology and Marxism, maybe a Marxist humanist perspective.
And this is where I what I would encourage people to do, and I know it's hard, because of the sins of my faith. I know it's hard because of the sins of the black church, but I think that it's when you look at like what Jesus did, right? How he moved according to what's in the Bible, that ain't nothing but center and periphery. He kept going from the margins to the center to disrupt and went back into the margins. He brought people from the margins to the center to disrupt power, right? When the first church is formed, and I ain't talking about Constantine and all of that. This is why I'm very particular, as you know, about this stuff, because there's a history, right? The first church was socialist, each according to his needs, and like the apostles brought everybody brought in their stuff, and they distributed equally as according to need. And when somebody tried to cheat the system, they were struck dead. Ananias and Sapphira. So this here, the divine God is saying you violated the community rules. You didn't even have to be a part of the community. You came to the community trying to run a hustle. And so this is where there's socialist elements. The entire construct of the Israelites in the wilderness, if you read it, there's socialism in there. The manna, you had to share resources, you had to survive. When you tried to hoard, God called you out. And so I think that what has happened, and this is why what I tell people to do is this: as much as you can, just read it as a book. Read it as you would, and pull out themes, the thematic things. So if you're a believer, turn off Hezekiah Walker, turn off Andre Crouch. You ain't meditating, and just read. Just read. So when Jesus literally says, "Hey, collect to redistribute."
So let me press you. Now, Obioma is shooting back, and she responds, science and faith ask different questions, how and why. And what I want to suggest here is that the conversation that you just had, that information, and I would agree with you that the Bible is deeply socialist, but it's utopian socialism, not Marxism, not scientific socialism. And I think that that's a circle that's harder to, a square that's harder to turn into a circle. But again,
But I would argue
should
all
be
of
in
what
play.
we do is for a push for a better tomorrow, right? Because if we would have won and been there, then we wouldn't be having all these conversations. So on some level, all of what we dream and fight for has an element of utopiaism, right? This is the ideal we're pressing for. Some of it's grounded in a little more reality, some of it's grounded in a little more evidence, facts, no dispute. But at the end of the day, when my son was born, I had a utopian dream that this dude, like we all have hopes. So I think that part of this pessimistic thing that our people have now, I need everything to be reason and fact based. I don't know, man. My grandmama, she didn't need reason and fact to hope that I would be here today. Like she pressed for and believed for a better tomorrow. And so I think even in the construct of science and faith asks how and why, I think faith also, if you use it right, asks how and why. Why am I in a space from as a dude from the south side of Chicago? Why am I down in Champaign Urbana? And how am I gonna make this work? And how am I gonna make this work? Why did I come down here about to get married? Oh, and how the hell did I end up not? So I think that faith, when properly used, and I'm not talking about, this is why I push back on the Disney motif. This is why I push back on the Avengers motif. This what I would call comic book faith. Real faith should force you to ask yourself how and why. Why am I here, and how do I navigate it? And the belief in that something greater than me can sustain and carry me through.
So I would approach it somewhat differently and say that the types of questions asked and the process are different, but we can arrive at the same place, right? Because as a Marxist, I'm going to explain the world from the standpoint of actual social structures. So I'm going to talk about economic arrangements that lead history to mainly be a history, right, of contention between the classes that sit at opposite poles. One class that is extracting surplus value from the other class, slave and master, worker and capitalist, on and on and on. And that we're struggling to create this humane society that we call socialism. I think the socialist preachers come at it a little bit differently, but end up in pretty much the same space. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's what's most important is where do we end up?
And right? I don't disagree with that. I think that again, it's how you use these things, and I think that therein lies some of the challenges. I don't disagree with, like, in my final analysis, I don't disagree with how you said. I do think that sometimes there are different starting points, but I also think that where you end up is generally, even if we ain't right in front of the house together, we walking up the block, right? And we gonna meet in front of the house. But that's why, at least as a reverend, I don't lose my sleep over these trivial things, as long as we can meet in front of the house. So if for you it's pure scientific method, cool. Is black people being pushed to be free? Because folks use scientific method to say black people can't be free. So for you, are you using it for the liberation of our people? Great, I love you. Shot of whiskey on me. Your faith, are you using it for the liberation of your people? Because there are people who use faith to say that they ain't gonna be liberated. So I think, are we? We ain't necessarily got to touch, but are we walking together?
That's right.
Halfway trying to agree. And I think that both sides of the coin can do a little bit more to be graceful in this matter. I remember when I told somebody here that you were my mentor, and I think I shared this story with you, and oh my God, but Doc is one of my biggest supporters. And I ain't been more, listen, I got game, y'all, but I can't get him to give his life to Christ. Like, he laughed me out of his face. But he's one of my biggest supporters, right? And so we journey together. I'd fight a brick for Dr. Sundiata. So, but I think both sides get this thing where they're dismissive of the other when we all trying to set people free.
That's
and
right. That's right.
We got to get back to that, man. Like, if you don't believe in my Jesus, cool. You can't disrespect my faith, and I won't disrespect you. So you can't be telling me you worship a fake God. Like, some things you just can't say to me unless you're ready to throw hands, because this is my faith. This is core of my being. This is about, but if we can, work together, cool. Let's work together, man. There's plenty of work to be doing, because there's going to come a day where I'm going to need scientific method, and I promise you it's going to come a day you're going to need some motherfucking faith. So
you're going to need values. I've always appreciated my upbringing in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I learned my nationalism in the AME Church, right? I had a pastor from Canada, and he taught me that Harriet Beecher Stowe lied. She demeaned and degraded a heroic AME minister, Josiah Henson, by turning him into Uncle Tom, when he had led Black people out of slavery into Canada and created an institution in an all-Black community called Don. I learned about Henry McNeil Turner saying, God is a Negro, and wanting to take folks back. So I've always appreciated that, as well as the set of values that you learn in the church. And I know that these are things that in a socialist society, we're looking for people to practice those kinds of communal and humane values. And I see that. So we're coming down to the end. We got 4 minutes. I think I've addressed all of the pertinent questions. And so let me say you've got exactly 3 minutes now, Rev, to talk about whatever you want to talk about. You can talk about the work that you're doing, right? The practical struggle work that you're participating in Champaign, or whatever is on your mind,
So I
my
will
brother?
say this again. I'll take 30 seconds to say this. Listen, I acknowledge that Christianity as practice has been problematic. I'd be the first to acknowledge that. I'd be the first to acknowledge that the black church has dropped the ball. But ultimately it's a personal decision. Like, I'm one of the preachers. I tell folks all the time, people tell me I don't believe in GL, you need to be more. I lose no sleep over that. If you come join the church, great. You come into the faith, great. Are you trying to free black people? Outside of that, that's on you, man. You want to have a beer? So I don't get back and forth with them. I'm not a proselytizing preacher, man. If you ain't never walked into a church and gave Jesus your life, that's on you, my dude. Like, let's go get a cheeseburger. In terms of the work, there's a lot we are doing in Champaign-Urbana, and it's centered out of the church. We are trying to reimagine policing through the Ubuntu network. We're trying to get the community to develop a critical conscience to take some issues seriously. So we're doing congregational training. We're training folks how to organize, how to engage power, how to challenge systems of oppression. We are getting the community to rethink policing. We don't need this draconian policing. We don't need an occupying force. Like, we bringing back old school stuff. So we're trying to do that. We're putting people into a room, across team of folks. So you got academics, you got politicians, you got preachers who are coming together for the betterment, who are practicing literally the model that I'm talking about. We don't all agree. Some of us we ain't got the same faith tradition. We don't even talk to. But at the end of the day, are we trying to free black people? Are we trying to free our folks? And so that's kind of some of the things we're doing in Ubuntu. For those that are interested, that have a spiritual side, every Sunday on Facebook, Bethel AME Champaign, we broadcast live. You won't see no white Jesus, and you ain't gonna be told that you got to be beat by a slave master to go to heaven. I'm trying to tell you right now, hey, listen, let's go get free. Let's take our freedom. Like Nat Turner said, and God will be with us if we take our freedom. So I think that's pretty much it. I want to thank you for having me here. I appreciate it. It's been a long time since I got to ask some of these questions. So Obadiah is the MVP of the night, because she had me ready to hit the X. I had to compose myself like, shit, it's time to go. Like, oh damn. I told you to start I needed some coffee here, so I'm over here like
Reverend, I am, I'm pleased to have you.
Thank you, sir.
You have been a bright light in this community, and I know that light shines very, very far, because if we can begin to move that historic institution in the ways that it will recommit itself to the liberation of our people, right? The pace will pick up substantively. So let me say that this has been Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua, and our guest has been the Reverend Terrence Thomas, pastor of Bethel AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Champaign, Illinois, a true brother on the front line struggling. And thank you so much for gracing me with your presence.
And honor to be here, Doc.
Let me say we are out of here.